While Coraline is not based on true events, the film still manages to feel incredibly real. Part of this is the beautiful animation and story both blend reality and fantasy, giving a surreal quality to it. But most importantly, it captures a sense of powerlessness we have all experienced in some way as children. The writer Neil Gaiman uses this throughout so many of his works. He was once asked why his lead characters usually find themselves suddenly thrown into a new world with new rules and little resources. This new reality always existed around them, but they were just unaware of it. To which he answered,
"Because absolutely everybody here starts out like that."
So let's talk about Coraline, how children are treated, and why it matters. Before we dive in, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you won't be powerless in knowing when we release new videos. Also, there will be child abuse mentioned in this video. I give an additional warning before the main discussion of it, but if you don't feel comfortable watching, I understand. And of course, there will be spoilers ahead for Coraline. In case you haven't seen it or need a refresher, Coraline is about a young girl who finds a door in the house her family has just moved into, which leads to another world. Unlike Alice in Wonderland or Narnia, this world is more of a mirror of the real world. While her own parents don't have time for her and are often quite nasty towards her, in the parallel world, Coraline's other mother and father are happy to play and do whatever she likes. When Coraline realizes the affection is a trap, she flees to the real world only to find her parents have been taken. So Coraline has to return and face the other mother to rescue them. What really gives Coraline its sense of creepiness and danger is much more than just the other mother. Although the other mother is incredibly creepy, not just in the way she slowly changes into a more spider-like creature, but in her methods, luring children in by giving them love and attention they are unable to get elsewhere. This tactic, often referred to as love bombing, probably wouldn't have been so effective if Coraline didn't feel so neglected by her own parents. It's this real-world portrayal that makes Coraline so memorable and makes the fantasy world within it that much creepier. Coraline's life isn't exactly great, and she escapes into a fantasy world only to find it's even worse than the life she already has. Most child-friendly films, even when showing awful situations, tend to romanticize childhood. And to be clear, I love these movies, but Coraline shows how mundane and awful childhood can really feel sometimes. Coraline is regularly treated like a nuisance.
We made a deal. Zip it.
And while her parents' behavior is likely due to stress from their jobs and having just moved, they never stop and give any time to explain anything to Coraline. Instead, whenever she tries to get their attention, she is rejected, if not also insulted.
I bet those actresses would love to hear your dream.
Miss Spink and Forcible? But you said they're dingbats.
As a disabled parent of 3 children myself, I get it. Sometimes things are overwhelming and I'm not able to live up to the expectations I try to hold for myself. But that's not my kid's fault, just like it's not Coraline's. So I love that the film clearly empathizes with Coraline while avoiding a lot of other common pitfalls. Like, the film does not portray the problem as Coraline having too much freedom or that strangers are dangerous. I find this important because the idea of something like stranger danger, while well-meaning, can cut kids off from help, especially because most abuse comes from someone we know, not strangers. Coraline's curiosity is also clearly shown as healthy and good. Without her exploration, she would not have known about the well, which was crucial in defeating the other mother. And while Coraline's curiosity initially led to her wanting the door to the other world opened, she didn't intend to leave it open.
You didn't lock it.
Her mother's response leaves Coraline vulnerable, emotionally and literally. It's also worth noting the other mother can have some impact on the world, like when she takes Coraline's parents. So while Coraline did venture into the other world on her own, she would likely have to face the other mother eventually, no matter what. The other mother isn't going to just wait around in her world and die when she's hungry. She just prefers to wait for children to come to her so she can act affectionate and offer an illusion of choice for them.
There now. It's your decision, darling. We only want what's best for you.
Because in the real world, they get no choice at all. No adults end up coming around to believe Coraline either. She does try to reach out for help, like calling the police, but of course they are of no use. Coraline must face everything on her own except for a little bit of help from YB. If Coraline was going to get help from anyone, it makes sense it would be another child. It's clear from all of this that it isn't fair Coraline had to face this danger. She hasn't done anything to cause this. And doesn't that sum up the experience of most children, especially those who suffer from abuse? Feeling you have no agency even when harm is directed at you. And then the film does something else unique. We don't see Coraline's parents change when this is all over. Sure, their circumstances have improved, but they haven't learned a lesson from all of this. They don't even realize anything has happened. The film shows us Coraline's bravery and ability to pull through and survive without suggesting it was good she suffered. Coraline shows us there are people who will intend us harm and others who will hurt us without meaning to do so. That the world we live in is unfair, especially to children, because children are oppressed. I doubt you think kids are just a bunch of snowflakes if you're watching this video, but even if you think kids have it tough, you might not call it oppression. You may be surprised to find out that the writer of Coraline, Neil Gaiman, does. In his essay, What the F is a Children's Book Anyway, Gaiman says,
"Children are a relatively powerless minority, and like all oppressed people, they know more about their oppressors than their oppressors know about them. Information is currency, and information that will allow you to decode the language, motivations, and behavior of the occupying forces on whom you are uniquely dependent for food, for warmth, for happiness, is the most valuable information of all. Children are extremely interested in adult behavior. They want to know about us."
Gaiman's belief and understanding of this comes through in his works like Coraline. Two of the most common criteria determining if a group like children are oppressed are: 1, they must exist in a system that treats them unfairly, and 2, that the unfair treatment does not require bad intentions. Sound familiar? And of course, Coraline is regularly exploring and asking questions to learn more, but is often denied information. The little information she is able to get, she uses to survive. These themes are present in many of Gaiman's stories, including some of his most popular, like American Gods and Sandman. One of the first moments I fell in love with Gaiman's work, before I had even read his essay mentioning child depression or even seen Coraline, was when I read this passage in Ocean at the End of the Lane. It is from the perspective of the protagonist, who is a young boy speaking about his father.
"I became terrified of him when he was angry. His face, angular and usually affable, would glow red, and he would shout so loudly and furiously that it would literally paralyze me. I would not be able to think. He never hit me. He did not believe in hitting. He would tell us how his father had hit him, how his mother had chased him with a broom, how he was better than that. When he got angry enough to shout at me, he would occasionally remind me that he did not hit me, as if to make me grateful."
This passage brings me back to my childhood every time I read it. The terror in the implicit threats that more force could be used. The anger at the wrongness, and more anger still that my indignation was twisted as ingratitude. And finally, resignation and helplessness. I don't think you can write a passage like this without truly understanding how that feels. And it is rare that an adult has retained this understanding even as they've aged and become a parent themselves, like Gaiman has. Too often we find ways to justify what we've all had to experience or forget how bad it truly was as we grow older. We humans are very good at normalizing things. We have a long track record of doing some pretty terrible things and taking quite a long time to acknowledge they are in fact terrible, and longer still to stop doing them, assuming we ever acknowledge them at all. As Neil Gaiman says later in the same essay, in response to his father explaining the phrase, "the happiest days of your life means your school days."
This seemed nonsensical to me then, and I suspected it of being either adult propaganda or, more likely, as confirmation of my creeping suspicion that the majority of adults actually had no memories of being children.
So, let's look at what oppression is, rather than rely on our memories. Oppression is a politically determined status with implications for policy, practice, and education. Oppressed groups are broadly considered to be vulnerable to exploitation and discrimination. There are many methods that have been developed to determine oppression. The two criteria I mentioned earlier are common requirements. I don't think anyone would completely disagree that things are unfair for children, unless the argument basically boils down to, yeah, it's unfair, but it's necessary. The second criteria, regarding not needing intent, is especially important because we often see people dismiss harm because the perpetrator means well. Like, I don't think Coraline's parents are awful people, and they clearly love her daughter. But also, the way they treat Coraline sucks. Both things can be true. And people will make this argument even when it comes to widespread systemic oppression. I mean, there are people with a straight face who will try to argue slavery was good actually. Impact is always more important than intent. It also can be quite hard to prove intent, but we can look at various parts of a system to see how groups of people are impacted. Here are several domains to consider that would apply to child oppression. Children can be considered an age-related minority group since they have physical, social, and cultural differences from the dominant social group of adults. Children frequently experience abuse and/or neglect. For example, in the United States, it is estimated 1 in 7 children do, and according to the CDC, this is likely an underestimate. Children do not choose what family they are born into and have little to no say in changing that. Children are expected to be entirely dependent and so are often barred either legally or practically from accessing resources, even vital ones like healthcare. There are limited legal protections for children, and within the legal system itself, children do not generally have a right to independent legal representation. Children are unable to vote, meaning they are not even granted that tiny bit of political power to change their situation. These are all domains that have been applied to other marginalized groups to help describe their oppression. I want to especially focus on points 2, 3, and 4 in relation to Coraline. As I said earlier, Coraline doesn't do anything wrong to create the awful scenario she has to live through. One of the things I love about the addition of Wybie in the film, since he's not in the book, is that he also spends a lot of time exploring. The only difference between Coraline and Wybie is he just happened to not be staying in the part of the house with the magic door. As this passage from Coraline says,
"It is astonishing just how much of what we are can be tied to the beds we wake up in the morning. And it is astonishing how fragile that can be."
The environment we are born into has a huge impact on our lives. Around the world, over 1 billion children suffer violence. One of the largest factors is poverty, something completely out of control for the child. Honestly, it's mostly out of control for their parents as well. But even if someone is born into better means, it doesn't mean they will be treated well. Unfortunately, most children do not get much freedom, even over simple things in their day: what they eat, when they go to sleep, what they read, learn, or even the clothes they wear. Which means they have almost no way to change their environment in a meaningful way, because this includes more important decisions as well. They will not get a choice in what kind of education they get, or even what they learn. They don't get to decide what cultures or religions they want to participate in. And to be clear, education, culture, and traditions can be important, but I think children should have a large say rather than being treated like dolls that were created simply to be molded into supposedly real people. They are already real people. The other mother represents an extreme of this. She only cares about Coraline in so much as it benefits herself. And while the other mother clearly means Coraline harm, it's important to note that it can be just as harmful when a parent has good intentions. We often see adults rationalize any treatment of a child because it will improve their future, and the child will thank you later.
You may come out when you've learned to be a loving daughter.
Despite how important an environment is to a child's well-being, if you end up with someone like the other mother caring for you, there's really not much you can do. For the most part, your environment will only change through adoption, divorce, or a government program intervening. Children often do not get any say when these occur. In the United States, for example, you likely would only have your opinion considered if you were around the ages of 12 to 14. Even though many children certainly understand what's going on in their home life at a fairly young age. This is another thing I really liked about Wybie. We get to see another child with a different background from Coraline that has also had to struggle. All we know is he lives with his grandmother, but when you consider YB is short for why born, we have some good guesses as to why he's now living with his grandmother.
Why were you born?
The only remaining option for a child to escape their environment is emancipation. This gives a child legal independence, freeing them from control by parents or guardians. However, this is a long and difficult process and only is an option for children who are much older. Many of the requirements to get an emancipation are unrealistic due to how little freedom children have in the first place. It's extremely unlikely you can support yourself financially or be living apart from parents already, while also being denied access to resources, jobs, and more. You could get married or join the military, which doesn't seem great to push kids into, to say the least. Although even if a child wanted to, they have to get parental consent to do either of these things. Something tells me the other mother wouldn't be on board with that. And what if a child started life with someone like the other mother? With access to learning and the outside world controlled, they may not even have a sense of if they are being abused. Whatever they grow up experiencing will seem normal to them. Because parents may effectively control everything that exists in a child's world, there is little to protect them from someone like the other mother. Many places that might spot abuse are also places children may not go alone. For example, a doctor would be required to report if a child was suspected of being maltreated, but you need parental consent to see a doctor. There is a well-known case in the United States that I think illustrates the worst of what can happen, and it was an important Supreme Court case that set precedent since 1989. I want to give a content warning that this case involves extreme child abuse. If you're not comfortable with that, you may want to skip ahead to the next section, which you'll be able to find the chapters or timestamps down below. DeShaney versus Winnebago County was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1989 in a 6-3 ruling that a child's 14th Amendment rights were not violated if a state government agency failed to prevent child abuse by a custodial parent. In this case, a 2-year-old Joshua was in custody with his father, Randy DeShaney. There had been a police report of child abuse and a hospital visit in January of 1983, which led the Department of Social Services, also known as DSS, to get a court order to keep Joshua in the hospital's custody. 3 days later, Joshua was recommended to be released by a child protection team, which consisted of a pediatrician, a psychologist, a police detective, county lawyer, several DSS caseworkers, and various hospital personnel. Juvenile court dismissed the case, and Joshua stayed with his father. Although DSS did make an agreement with the father Randy to keep checking in on Joshua. In the same year as that hospital visit, the following then happened. DSS noted Randy was not complying with the agreement's terms. A DSS social worker had visited and reported suspected child abuse 5 times, as well as another hospital visit in November, less than a year later from the previous hospital visit that started getting DSS involved. Child abuse was reported again. No action during this year was taken. Then, shortly after, in January and March of 1984, Randy claimed Joshua was too sick to see the DSS social worker on their visit. After that March visit, 4-year-old Joshua had been beaten so severely he fell into a life-threatening coma. Emergency brain surgery revealed a series of hemorrhages caused by traumatic injuries to his head inflicted over a long period of time. So, even with state agencies being involved, Joshua went through hell and was permanently injured by his own father. Since then, this Supreme Court ruling has been used to excuse government agencies from being culpable when failing to protect. An important note to consider was brought up by Associate Justice William Brennan at the time as one of the 3 dissenting votes on the case. He said, "If a state cuts off private sources of aid and then refuses aid itself, it cannot wash its hands of the harm that results from its inaction." In Wisconsin at the time, child protection laws had created a state regime because no one but DSS was allowed to intervene. If a private citizen or other government body knew of child abuse, their only option was to contact DSS. So the system cut off all possible help for Joshua and then just stood by and watched. That is what systemic oppression allows. In the 10th anniversary Q&A for the book Coraline, Neil Gaiman had this to say about the story.
It's not a story about fear, but one about bravery. After all, if a dragon is going to be defeated, it should be worth the fight. And the thing that calls herself the other mother is that.
It is in that spirit I wanted to discuss the themes Gaiman so clearly cares about in Coraline. I hope that we can see child oppression for the dragon it is, and that it is worth the cost of fighting. I want children to experience less harm and more freedom. I want future generations to have it easier. But beyond just wanting children to have better lives, I also think this affects us all. I believe it's easy to forget what it's really like being a child as we grow older, to view those years as some sort of hazing ritual that we all just have to endure. I think looking at how we treat children and the environments we sculpt for them says a lot about our values and what our systems uphold. And it leaves me asking questions like, does experiencing oppression at a young age normalize that sometimes it is acceptable to treat people differently and unfairly? Does experiencing powerlessness to change anything, even when harm is being done to us or others, convince us nothing can be meaningfully changed? And I often think about how media that is more aimed at children tends to paint ideals of treating each other well and fairly, and how as children we experience that as hypocrisy. The actions of adults around us don't match what they tell us to do. Think of the golden rule. Treat others as you want to be treated. But do we treat children how we want to be treated? The answer is clearly no, right? Like, how do you feel if I say, I'm going to treat you like a child? I worry this contributes to people growing up thinking, this is just how the world works, or that wanting to change our systems and treat people fairly is somehow childish. When conservatives argue about protecting children, it's always framed as some form of parents' rights issue. I think there should be more focus on children's rights instead. I don't want to give more control to someone like the other mother, and I don't think that my rights as a parent are at odds with my children's rights. I also think improving children's rights will benefit us all. If our children had better material conditions, then it would also help us. Not to mention, think of the lasting impact those gains create for the future. How much better would our conditions be if we had started off better? How much would that end up benefiting our kids? And so on. Cycles are often repeated, but maybe they don't always have to be negative. Coraline shows us children are not only capable, but oftentimes must be braver than adults. We can't make children safe by just giving others around them more power and control. We have to empower children directly. Coraline is given information and tools, but she must figure out how to use them herself. In Gaiman's stories like Coraline, it's children who are the heroes and adults are clueless, if not outright obstacles. No one ever found the victims of the other mother. It took a child like Coraline to free them. And in the final struggle, Wybie and Coraline, the two children of the film, save each other to be rid of the other mother forever. I am hopeful as studies continue to explore things like adverse childhood experiences, so we will gain a better understanding of what harm is being done, so empowering children becomes a priority. One of the more interesting ideas I have seen is to get rid of age-based classification entirely. I mean, really, why should we assume children are less competent than adults making all critical decisions? We should instead try to figure out what competencies are needed for children to safely and successfully participate in decision-making about their rights. If identified, we could develop ways to determine those competencies are met. I don't think this is perfect, as I could see potential pitfalls, especially depending on how a competency test could be designed, but a decent example may be something like how we currently have driving tests. It doesn't make any sense to me how we currently act like children have no understanding of the world. They should be given more agency whenever possible. This includes political power as well. As it stands now, children have no real experience with democracy growing up. We should probably at a minimum lower the voting age. It's not difficult to see that people are more informed and eager to participate in politics at a younger age, and other countries have already taken steps like lowering the age to 16. Preferably we do more than that. Politics is a lot more than voting. In fact, voting is very little. Children could be given a role in local governments so they can actively participate in advocating for their rights. We have seen minor versions of this in some states like Louisiana and Virginia. I'm not trying to argue any specific plans, but the larger point is just that children should be treated as capable human beings like they are, not possessions or things to be ruled over. And we can all start today, especially if we are in a position of authority. Parents, teachers, or even just as a member of our communities. We can give children more agency and do our best to advocate and treat children with more respect. It's important to instill the belief in children that things can change and that they are capable of making change happen. And that's what I love so much about Coraline, because it does just that.
Fiction is the lie that tells the truth. We all have an obligation to daydream. We have an obligation to imagine. It is easy to pretend that nobody can change anything, that society is huge and the individual is less than nothing. But the truth is, individuals make the future. And they do it by imagining that things can be different.
Coraline is a timeless story because no matter what age you are, there is something you can relate to. As children, we are shown bravery so we don't feel so alone, and that we are more capable than we know, no matter how the world may make us feel. As adults, it reminds us that childhood most likely was not the best, even if there were things we loved about it, and hopefully inspires us to use those memories to show more empathy to children. And that couldn't be accomplished without the compassion and understanding of children by its writer, Neil Gaiman. How do you wish children were treated better? And are there any other films like Coraline you'd recommend? Personally, if you like Coraline, I highly recommend many of Neil Gaiman's other works, especially Ocean at the End of the Lane. I'm currently reading the Sandman comics and loving them, so I'm looking forward to the upcoming series on Netflix, as Neil Gaiman is directly involved.
Grown-ups don't look like grown-ups on the inside either. Outside, they're big, thoughtless, and they always know what they're doing. Inside, they look just like they always have, like they did when they were your age. Truth is, there aren't any grown-ups. Not one in the whole wide world.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and a special thanks to our patrons. Please check out all the awesome people who helped lend their voices for this video. All their links are down below. Which brings us to our recommendation, Sakura Tetris. Not only was he one of the wonderful voices, but on his channel, he combines two of my favorite things, philosophy and games. I loved hearing about colonization expressed in Greedfall, and his recent video on tips for overcoming anxiety and playing multiplayer games. I know I hesitate to jump into multiplayer nowadays. Please take care of yourselves, and remember, you're not alone.